And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today. Starting off yet another week of defending, explaining, sharing the Catholic faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. Got a great show to kick off the week for you in that we have Master Apologist Pat Flynn coming on board, and he's a familiar person with the show. As you know, Pat is a convert to the Catholic faith. Actually, he became an atheist, and a rather studious atheist indeed. In fact, it was his study in atheism that ultimately led him to start looking for alternatives. And eventually he stumbles upon Thomas Aquinas, and lo and behold, he reasons himself not only into belief that God does in fact exist, but ultimately into the Catholic Church. And today we're going to talk about the rest of the story. We've had Pat on a few times to do some pretty high-level theistic apologetics, proofs for the existence of God. Today we're going to talk about the case for Catholicism and ultimately, what led him to move from belief that God exists to belief that Christ is God, and ultimately that Christ established the Catholic faith. So he's going to be coming up on the other side of the break. We also have our Finding the Fallacy. Today's fallacy is the begging of the question. And we're going to meet an early church father who is St. Clement of Rome. So great stuff in store for us. So I'm seeing the emoji explosions occurring at the social media section of the dojo. So let me give my shout-outs. Hello, everybody watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for all the colorful emojis. I appreciate it. And I also want to thank all of you listening via radio around the country and also through podcasts around the world. And it's great to have you. Hopefully, you could keep us in your prayers, keep us in your charitable contributions, keep us share us on social media. I mean, that if you want to be a missionary, that's a great way to do it. If you haven't subscribed to Hands-On Apologetics, please do so. We actually have a channel there on YouTube. And do all the social media type things that people do, like, subscribe, tell people, link on Facebook, do all those things. Pass the word around because the more the merrier. Let's share the wealth in terms of all these great guests that we have on the show. Not only for Hands-On Apologetics, by the way, but all the shows produced by Virgin Most Powerful, like Jesus 911, Terry Jesse Show, Matthew Honors Show, all sorts of great stuff. So please continue to pass the word around. And let's see. By the way, if you can't catch all of the program, I mentioned podcast. You can download podcast, all our podcasts, via our handy-dandy phone app, which is Virgin Most Powerful Radio phone app. Just go on your iStore, download the app, or you could always go to our flagship website, which is www.virginmostpowerfulradio, all one word, .com. Or excuse me, .org. I always want to say .org, but it's .org. It's not .com. Okay, the sensei kind of had a senior moment there, but yes, it's .org. I've only given it out like a million times. Let's see. Also, if you have any emails, maybe you shy to call the show. Maybe you have a question, but you don't want to pose it to our guest, Pat Flynn. You can always send us an email at questions@handsonapologetics.com. Okay, I got that one right. questions@handsonapologetics.com. They do fly through the internet into my dojo mailbox where I do reply. So keep them coming, folks. And let's see, why don't we jump right into our material, shall we? Today's Finding the Fallacy, our critical thinking skills exercises, is the begging of the question. Begging the question. This is a very fundamental, very commonly committed fallacy. And it's one of those fallacies, I got a pet peeve, because it's also one of those fallacies that people abuse over time. They label things as begging the question, when it's not begging the question. For example, if someone says, well, I saw this certain person at a restaurant and it wasn't their boyfriend or girlfriend, and that begs the question, who was it? No, that's not begging the question. What they mean is they're begging to ask the question, not the fallacy begging the question. The fallacy begging the question is quite simple. It's where you assume the conclusion as part of your argumentation and then using that conclusion to prove your conclusion. In other words, it goes around and around in a circle. So you could say, the Bible is the Word of God. How do I know? Because the Bible says so, and since it's the Word of God, it can't lie. Therefore, it's the Word of God. There's a classic begging the question. You assume the Bible is the Word of God at the outset, and then you use the Bible to prove that it's the Word of God based on the fact that it's the Word of God. And it's very easy to spot when the begging the question occurs because you get a sense of dizziness as you're following the argument as it unfolds because it kind of wraps itself around itself. So it's if you ever try to follow an argument and it seems like it's just going around and around in circles, chances are it is begging the question. And that is our fallacy for today. Question. And so okay, I'm a nerd. I have some fallacies I have pet peeves with. So do not abuse that. Use begging the question for the fallacy, not for something that you want people to answer something. Okay. Enough of that. Let's move on to the Meet the Early Church Father. Every episode, we go into one of the early church fathers and talk a little bit about their biography. We use a 3-volume set known as Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers for the biographical material. And today is a very important one. It's extremely early Christian writing, extra-biblical writing, and it's by a pope. It's Pope St. Clement I of Rome. Now, when Pope St. Clement reigned as pope is a matter of speculation. We're not exactly sure of the dates. There are various early lists, in fact, where the Bishop of Rome makes Clement either the second or third successor of St. Peter. Part of the reason is because there's a couple of lists are switch him back and forth with Cletus or Anticletus, which could be two people or one person. But nevertheless, he's definitely there at the very beginning. All lists have Peter, and then Linus, then usually Cletus, and then Clement. That's usually what you'll find. Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers says that according to Origen and Eusebius, Clement of Rome was a collaborator with St. Paul, who was and there was mentioned in the epistle to the Philippians in Philippians 4:3. Although Jurgens thinks that that's probably not the same Clement, but nevertheless it is an important little factoid to note. And but nevertheless he certainly deserves the title of being an apostolic father because he is a close associate with St. Peter the Apostle. By the way, I should probably mention that there is a classification within the early church fathers that those that are very early who had some contact with the apostles or the immediate disciples of the apostles, those are known as the apostolic fathers. So Pope St. Clement I would be considered an apostolic father. We have only one writing from him. It's an authentic writing. It's the letter to the Corinthians. The dating of the letter is a little bit, again, there's a little bit of a dispute when, which you kind of figure if there's a little dispute about his pontificate when he reigned, chances are there'd be a little bit of a dispute as to, when the letter was written. Generally, scholars kind of put it back towards maybe the year 102, 103 AD, which is still very early, or perhaps 92, 98 I've seen. But there's good reason to believe that the letter is actually much earlier. And here I'm going to go to Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers. It says that the letter mentions Claudius and Valerius as the people who accompany this letter. and such names can, Jurgen says, such names can scarcely be otherwise explained as belonging to freed slaves from the household of the Emperor Claudius and his wife Valeria Messalina, who died in 48 AD, and Claudius died around 54 AD. So Roman law prohibits the freeing of a slave under 30 years of age, and it's evident then that these two men in question cannot have been born after AD 20 or somewhere thereabouts. And if they were freed near the beginning of Claudius's reign, then they must have been born around AD 10. Okay, so the letter notes that these emissaries had grown old in the faith, but if the letter is dated as is customary 96, 98 AD, these emissaries would be something like 80 or 90 years old, which, it's hard to believe that, 80-year-olds or 90-year-olds would be sent running to Corinth with letters, right? So Jurgens points out it's much easier to believe that these men who had grown old in the faith were likely around 60 years of age, and that would mean that the letter was written sometime around AD 80. Say that 3 times quickly. Which case the sudden calamities that's mentioned in the writings may well be a reference to either a dubious persecution or a natural disaster such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius outside of Naples, which took place in 79 AD. So that is our early church father for today, Pope St. Clement of Rome. Coming up on the other side of the break, Master Apologist Pat Flynn, and we're going to be talking about the case for Catholicism. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back.
How does the baby move in your tummy? How does the baby eat? Can the baby hear me? How did the baby get in there?
Wow, a pregnancy can sure generate a lot of questions. But what's important is that a baby is a baby, inside and out of the womb. Not just after birth, but 9 months before, at conception.
That's right. Every baby is a miracle. Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org, or better yet, simply dial pound 250 on your cell phone and say the keyword pro-life. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
A baby's heart is beating 18 days from conception.
Pro-life across America, the Billboard people.
Jesus said to the apostles in Luke chapter 10, "Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me." According to St. Boniface, in her voyage across the ocean of this world, the Church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses. Our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on course. May our Lord help us remain ever faithful to His Church, to aid and defend her.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. And we're going to talk about the case for Catholicism. And there's no better person I can think of than Master Apologist Pat Flynn. Of course, Pat is the host of the Pat Flynn Show, which covers everything from fitness to mental health to business to writing to philosophy and theology. He's a best-selling author, philosopher, fitness coach, musician, and entrepreneur. And he expounds his theory of generalism, a theory applicable to each and every one of us. And you want to check out his website, which is www.chroniclesofstrength.com. And Pat Flynn, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Gary, it is always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always great to have you, and especially this topic because I think your sweet spot in apologetics is definitely theistic apologetics, proving the existence of God, His attributes.
Right.
You know that so well. But, we really haven't talked about, okay, once you come to the belief that God exists, then where do you go?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about a couple different things. First off, let me just say, I still think I'm digesting that Buddy's pizza you had me eat with you last month. So
yeah,
it slowed my thinking down
right?
a bit. Yeah, that was a really good, heavy, proper meal. But in between, these fits of indigestion from that, I've been thinking a lot more about apologetic tactics, because I never would have imagined that I would have been in the apologetics realm. I've always been interested and practicing philosophy. And it just so happened that led me to the Catholic faith, and I started writing about it. And then people started calling me an apologist. I'm like, well, hold on. I just wanted to know what was true. That's it.
Right.
And what I've realized, however, is that what has interested me, and what has been very revealing to me, is not necessarily what is helpful for other people in conversations as well. And I think we've made this distinction before, Gary, that for me there's a clear demarcation between the matter of apologetics and the manner. And the matter is understanding the arguments themselves, and perhaps going in depth, at least in one area. And like you said, for me, that would be natural theology. I'm nowhere near as strong on the other branches of apologetics. I think I have a good general ability to articulate the arguments well, but I have my area of specialization, which is kind of ironic coming from a generalist, but it is the truth. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that you also have to pay attention to the manner of how you present arguments. And what I've realized is that often going really into the weeds, into the technical weeds of like one specific argument, is not that helpful for most people most of the time. And what I've found in everyday conversations with people, what tends to be a very effective strategy is just giving a cumulative case for God or the Catholic faith, literally just a listing of the different arguments or reasons that you could use to show why Catholicism is true, without necessarily going into detail of any one. And that surprised me again and again and again, because you sort of present this cumulative case in hopes of going deeper. And then what you realize is people will stop there and they'll be like, oh, I never really thought about that. Just the notion that there are arguments and reasons, and more than one of them, for why you are a religious person often startles people and gives them something to think about in and of itself. So I've been thinking about, okay, what are some of these reasons or arguments we could give in a cumulative case to present for the Catholic faith? And could we serve it atop something like a platter of Pascal's wager? Because I found that is also a very interesting apologetic method as well. So just some things I've been stewing on.
Okay, now you mentioned Pascal's wager. So for those who aren't familiar with it, what is Pascal's wager?
Right, and this was something that I myself misunderstood for a long time until there's an excellent book on this by Dr. Michael Rhoda, and it's called Taking Pascal's Wager. And Pascal's wager is not an argument for God. It's an argument that you would be reasonable. It would be reasonable and responsible to go all in on God, and we can talk about what that means. If there's some degree of probability that Christianity might be true. So it's really for somebody who's in a position where maybe they think Christianity might be true. And what Pascal's wager does is, and it's hard to say exactly what that probability is. Say it's 50-50. 50-50, you think maybe Christianity is true or maybe atheism is true. That's when Pascal's wager comes in. And it says, hey, look, you have potentially an infinite amount to gain here and virtually nothing to lose. That it would be it would be really irresponsible and reckless to not at least live a life of religious seeking. And that's important too. We're not saying with Pascal's wager that you have to fake belief or that you have to be inauthentic. We're just saying, given that this might be true, there's some probability here, you have all the incentive you could possibly need to seek this out, to search further, to inquire more, to live a life of religious seeking, is how I typically like to frame it.
Yeah, I like that because you're right. It's often very often abused. That it's almost like well, it could be true, therefore commit yourself to Christianity, even if you don't believe, because if you're wrong, then you'll never know it. That type of thing. Or actually, it's more of a inducement to just seek, to look.
Right. It's one of those. It's an incentive, is the way I like to think of Pascal's wager. Is you understand what the stakes are, and you understand that the stakes are high and real. That if Christianity is true, you have, again, potentially an infinite amount to gain. I mean, eternal friendship with God, right? And that if Christianity is not true, then you have, relatively very little, if nothing, to lose. I mean, what would you lose? Maybe some of the temporary benefits of living a life of sin, say. And I think we could argue that most of those things are probably not good for you anyways, right? So are you really losing out on all that much? But we could even concede that. And it's like if you knew that there's a 50-50 chance that you could bet a certain amount and win an enormous amount of money, billions of dollars, and it only cost you a little bit of money, that you only had a little bit to lose and potentially a huge amount to gain, it would be, of course, reasonable and responsible to take that wager. Now, that isn't even a good analogy because, I mean, the promises of Christianity are infinite. So there's no like monetary amount or no finite amount that we can even make a comparison to. And I think it's important to understand that Pascal's wager is something that you kind of serve the Apologetics project atop, right? It's not something that you use by itself, like you said, because if somebody doesn't have any reasons for thinking Christianity is true, then it's not going to be a useful incentive. But if you could nudge somebody along and you could get them to the point of saying, okay, maybe it's true. And, what percentage does it have to be? Who cares? It's hard to say. But at least seeing that there's plausibility here, that's when Pascal's wager can be a helpful apologetic tool.
Yeah, very good. So in a sense, you would start your cumulative case and then ultimately end with Pascal's wager? Is that what you
Yeah, or at least ask somebody to keep Pascal's wager in mind before we get into some of these arguments. And I think it's helpful in conversations with people who might be skeptical, whether they're atheist or Protestant or whatever, to lower barriers to entry. Don't make too high of claims. Like, even if you think that you can prove with absolute certainty that God exists, why make the project more difficult for yourself than it needs to be? Just say things like, "Hey, I think it's reasonable to believe in God," or "I think we have good reasons to think that God's existence is more plausible or more probable than not." And I found that eases conversations. It makes the apologetic project much easier. And then if you can achieve that, which I think is an easier goal to achieve, that's when you can come in with Pascal's wager and hopefully encourage somebody to seek more and inquire more. And I think it's important in these types of conversations to have realistic expectations. I mean, when has anybody ever converted a skeptic on the spot, right? Like you go from like a dinner conversation to their baptism. When has that ever happened, right? Like never, right? Almost never, right? You got to focus on forming a relationship, forming friendships, being open, being sincere in exchanges, planting seeds. And it's almost always a process. And if you can just lower certain barriers to entry, make the project easier for yourself and for them, and have different approaches and tactics that you can use, I think your chances of success are going to be much higher.
Yeah, actually, I like that because, that is, I think, one of my Achilles' heels is I love to go into the weeds. I love to get into the minutia and kind of build up from scratch. But, cumulative argument, you kind of give them the bird's eye view. You could survey exactly what evidence is there, because otherwise, if you're in the weeds, they'll never know.
Yeah, and it does surprise me that, again, a lot of the conversations that I have, especially with my audience, and many of them are not religious, or maybe were religious and have fallen away, that they're just surprised to hear that arguments and evidence can even be given, because so many people are steeped in this culture where there's religion on one side and there's reason on the other side, or science on the other side, and they're just completely separate. Some would even hold that there's no compatibility between the two. And when people are just presented with an initial case, however superficial, that a reasonable case could be made or scientific evidence provided for the existence of God, that does something to people. It does something significant to people. I mean, that happened to me years ago. So I think it's important, before we start diving into really technical, complex, arguments, we keep in mind that we are not our audience a lot of the time, right? Us as philosophers and apologists and historians, right? Most people aren't coming from that perspective. And what might be important or impressive to us may just go way over the heads of the people that we're having conversations with. So how do we get back to the basics? How do we focus again as much on? It's important to know the arguments. Don't get me wrong. The matter is very important, but the manner, if we can't effectively communicate the truth of Christianity and Catholicism, then we're always going to be frustrating what we're called to do, which is evangelize.
Yeah, very good. We're coming up to a break, but I got one more quick question. The cumulative case, is it only for belief in the existence of God, or can we use it for other areas like Christian apologetics or even Catholic Protestant apologetics?
Yeah, I think we can use. I think it's obviously strongest and on best with belief for the existence of God. But there's two things I would say to that. One is, once you have the case for the existence of God, and once you have a robust classical theism, the Catholic Christian worldview just fits like a hand in a glove. And I think that's a really important thing to note, right? If God is absolutely simple, non-composite, eternal, omniscient, all wholly good, all loving, then Christ is like just kind of the sort of revelation we would expect, right? So I like to talk about degrees of expectation. Like, if this is true, is this data point the sort of thing that we might expect? And if this isn't true, then is this data point something that we would still expect? And it seems like if atheism is true, the whole rise of Christianity in general just seems absurd. Like, you just really can't make sense of any of it. But if theism is true, classical theism, then this makes sense. We might not have been able to predict it, but it fits well with the general worldview picture. So we'll say more about that after the break.
Excellent. We're chatting with Master Apologist Pat Flynn, and we're going to talk about that cumulative case after the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics. Stay tuned.
This is Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio. This March, VMPR, in association with the Catholic Resource Center, will be hosting a special conference for the Adoramus Society. Adoramus at the Triduum, a conference on the spirituality of the Triduum liturgies, featuring speakers Father Joseph Fessio, Dr. Anthony Lillis, and Christopher Karstens, addressing such topics as developing a liturgical spirituality, the spirituality of Holy Thursday, the spirituality of Good Friday, and the spirituality of the Paschal Vigil and Easter season. It all takes place March 14th, 2020, at the historic Sacred Heart Chapel at 381 West Center Street, Covina, California, 91723. You can register online at vmpr.org or call now at 877-526-2151 to reserve your seat today for Adoramus at the Triduum.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Pat Flynn about the cumulative case for Catholicism. And Pat, why don't we jump into it? When you're presenting a cumulative case, what kind of evidence do you put on the table?
Right. Well, a lot. So I hope your audience has a comfortable seat here. Well, I'll try to condense it to some of the ones that I think are really interesting and convincing, if not compelling. Again, when talking to a lot of people, language choice is important, right? So yeah. I do think some arguments for God's existence are compelling. I think that you really can't escape them except for on pain of incoherence. But I might just moderate my claims and just say I think these are convincing. I think this is good evidence. And I think that's, again, helpful lowering barriers to entry. So for theism in general, I'll say, hey, I think God is the best explanation for everything from contingency, the beginning of the universe, from 13.8 billion years ago, from no prior physical state, the fine-tuning of the universe for interactive, intelligent life, the general order, stability, and intelligibility of the universe, our perception of an objective moral realm of moral values and obligations. I think God is the best explanation for the irreducibility of human consciousness to purely physical processes alone. I think God is the best explanation for religious experiences, mystical experiences, near-death experiences. I think God is the best explanation for the sort of minimal facts that historians agree about the truths of Christianity, of Christ's life, death, and purported resurrection. And I think, very importantly, that God is the best explanation for the endurance and stability of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years of church history, in which the Church has stayed firm in her essential teachings of faith and morals. So there's a sort of initial collection or platter, Gary. You can jam on any or all of that.
Yeah, well, I like the way you set it up because you're not saying, God is true or Catholicism true because of X. You're basically saying that you believe God is the best explanation for each point, which I think is non-confrontative and actually kind of welcomes them to discuss the points.
Right, yeah, it invites further conversation,
yeah.
And we're making an inference to the best explanation. So, and I think this is important when talking about a cumulative case, because somebody might think, okay, maybe any one of those points isn't entirely convincing, either of God or Christianity or Catholicism in general. Like in a court case, right? You might have one piece of evidence, maybe you have a thumbprint or a piece of DNA evidence, and that alone might not be enough for you to want to convict somebody of a crime. But then it's the convergence of different but really converging forms of evidence, converging and convincing arguments, as Newman would say, that leads to your assent. So there's force through the cumulative case. Maybe you have a thumbprint here, a piece of DNA evidence there, an eyewitness testimony here. And when you have it all together, that's when you can make a reasonable and responsible inference. And you can reasonably and responsibly assent to a position that you may not have based on any one particular piece of evidence alone. And so I think that's important. I think that's powerful. And certainly there's an element of simplicity here. Not only is God the best explanation for these experiences and empirical evidence, he's also the simplest and the most unifying as well. And that too is very attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, when things happen in the real world, there's ramifications. You don't just have one data set that happens. It's usually multiple. There's reactions. There's counter reactions. There's implications and developments that stem from it. We don't live in a vacuum. And so what that does is it kind of fills in that not only, we believe God exists because of, look at all of these, reverberations, if you will, in terms of knowing, contingency and so on, and the facts of Jesus and the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and another way to think about it is just start with the hypothesis Catholicism is true, and then just go through any of these data points and ask, is that consistent? Does that make sense? Is that the type of thing that I would expect? So take the fine-tuning of the universe, right, which is one of the more remarkable discoveries of modern astrophysics in the past 20 to 40 years, that things seem to be dialed in just right, that they're balanced on a razor's edge, that if they were off just a teensy little bit in either direction, life as we know it would be impossible. In many cases, there wouldn't be chemistry, or the universe would have collapsed back in upon itself. Now, if there is an orderly, intelligent mind behind creation, is fine-tuning something that I would expect? That God would have intentions to be able to aim for a certain specific outcome? And the answer seems very obviously to me, yes. But if God didn't exist, is that something that I would expect? And the answer seems very obviously to me, no. And again, we don't need to assign specific probabilities here. It's just a matter of degree of expectation, right? I pick up my a book here, in this case, the Holy Bible, right? And there's sentence structure, there's words on a page, and I'm reading that, and I'm thinking, okay, if there wasn't intelligence behind this, would I expect the coherence and the sentence structure? And somebody might call me a creationist, go for it, but I can't imagine that this book would be here if there weren't some intelligent ordering mind behind it, right? Any book for that matter. That it's a monkey at a typewriter. I just cannot seriously entertain that hypothesis. I would not expect this book if there were not intelligence behind it. So I think just the simple tool of degree of expectation can be very helpful. And we can use this not just for God's existence, but Catholicism in particular, right? If Catholicism is true, might I expect confirmatory signs throughout history? Might I expect something like the miracle of the sun? And the answer seems to me obviously yes, right? It affirms these really important truths of the Catholic faith. It's publicly attested by some 70,000 people, many skeptics, many atheists who admitted they couldn't explain this. It seems to be something that is only explicable in terms of the supernatural. So that seems like something that would make sense. It makes no sense on atheism, and I think it's really hard to explain on Protestantism. So I think these simple tools of degree of and we could also say Eucharistic miracles as well. Given what Catholics believe in the real presence of Christ, might we expect some confirmatory signs of this, of additional miracles over and above transubstantiation throughout history, which I think we have really good evidence for, that fits with the hypothesis that Catholicism is true. And it seems to me, obviously, yes, that is something we might expect. Even if we don't predict it, it makes sense, given that we have this fundamental belief that Catholicism is true. It fits with that worldview, where it certainly doesn't fit with atheism, and I would argue there's a strong tension, if not an outright incompatibility with Protestantism as well. So I think you can make the case for Catholicism, not just theism, with this general approach.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let me play devil's advocate a little bit. Now,
rock on.
What worries me is sometimes atheists will come up with a similar method where they'll say, well, if God really did exist, then I would expect him to do X, Y, and Z. He would heal any righteous person who was sick just by asking, and they could come up with all sorts of things where they would imagine God to do if he exists.
Right.
Could the shoe be on the other foot and say, well, you're just kind of projecting what you think God would do, and then you're tying it together saying, well, that proves it, that it exists.
Well, I think this is I think it's the reverse. I think they're projecting. I think they're playing a role of divine psychology, right? If I were God, I would do this. Right. But what we're saying is we're not God, and this is what God has said that he has revealed and what God wants, right? And I think that is a critically important distinction. Christianity does not say that I mean, and let's just, from the healing amputees or anything like that, the problem of evil generally, right? This is usually what they get at, right? If God is all good and he's omnipotent, then he wouldn't allow any evil or suffering. But that makes a pretty profound assumption that Christianity rejects, that God created this world and this earth for us to just be fat, contented cows. And that isn't a core doctrine of our revelation, that this world and this earth has suffering in it, but that suffering can be used for a greater good, for us to be initiators of a loving, saving relationship with God's intention of this world isn't just to make his existence known. It's to invite us into an eternal, loving, saving relationship with himself. And God, being omniscient, is going to know the best ways to do that. And it might actually be patently annoying if he's just overwhelmingly hunking divine horn in front of our face all the time, right? We might get pestered with that, right?
Right.
So he gives us a certain degree of freedom and room to maneuver. So we don't speculate on divine psychology. We go based off of what we believe has been divinely revealed, of what God himself has said his intentions for creation are, because the skeptic isn't God, and thank God for that, right? Right? Who knows what I would do if I were God? But I'm very thankful I'm not God, because I'm limited, I'm finite. So we're just not in an epistemic position to make those kinds of probability judgments. So I think it's a subtle distinction, but it's a very important distinction. And we can talk more about the problem of evil, because I would actually push that further and say that if God did not exist, then I think it's highly improbable, if not impossible, that there would be any moral experiences at all, full stop. Of goodness as such or evil as such, that if God didn't exist and atheism were true, I just cannot see a plausible path to any beings of moral experience at all. So I would push that in the other direction and say that our moral experience, including the experience of evil, is actually weight in the scale for theism.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so in a sense, your cumulative approach is evidence-driven rather than just projecting what one would expect if you were God, or if Christ was God. It's basically, there's all these data points that need an explanation. The best explanation for them is ultimately God, Christ, and the Catholic Church.
Right, and we go based off of what we believe has been divinely revealed, what God has given to us by breaking into human history, and these doctrines are important. Because I think that they make sense of the data of our experience, including suffering and evil, because we have the doctrine of the fall. We have the doctrine of original sin. So given that, might it make sense that we find ourselves in the types of positions that we do? I think so.
Very good. Well, chatting with Pat Flynn, we'll be right back right after this. Stay tuned.
Jesus said in Luke 17, "When you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are unprofitable servants. We have only done our duty.'" According to St. John of the Cross, God is pleased with the little deeds we do in secret. He takes more pleasure in these than in a multitude of grand works that we may do out of the desire to be seen by others. May God help us to do the things that please Him, and not just to appear great in the eyes of others.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's, In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. We're chatting with Pat Flynn at the Pat Flynn Show, chroniclesofstrength.com. And he's given us a cumulative case for Catholicism. And Pat, I love that approach. Because, for example, if you started off offering the Fatima miracle, people could hem and haw and dispute and so on. But when you put it in context of this ongoing, miracles that happen throughout Christian history, the explosive growth of Christianity from antiquity, and that whole context, it really has a strength in its own that even if you can maybe nitpick at the miracle, it fits well within that whole pattern that you set forth.
That's right. It's not this sort of jarring, inexplicable intrusion. It's something that's consistent with the general worldview, and that's the point I'm trying to get across. Like if you're a naturalist, like, well, how you explain anything is beyond me as naturalism. That's why I gave up naturalism. Right? I just found it was entirely explanatorily inadequate. Right? I eventually got to points where I had to deny that even I existed. Wasn't willing to go that far. Right? But suppose that you're a naturalist and you still affirm at least your own existence. How you explain these miraculous accounts throughout history like Fatima is just absolutely beyond me. Whereas if you have a worldview, say you affirm that Catholicism is true, again, it might not be something you'd be able to predict, but it fits well with the worldview. It's a confirmatory sign, if you will, and it points back to the essential truths of the faith. And it would make sense that God, throughout history, would want to continue offering these types of confirmatory signs, Fatima, Eucharistic miracles, etc. Whereas if you're an atheist or even a Protestant, these are very, let's just call them at least inconvenient data points.
Right. Yeah,
they're inconvenient. They're inconvenient, right?
The inconvenient truth. I've heard it somewhere before.
But I was thinking about one more thing that you said. I think there's another helpful principle too. Is like once we see that there are really good reasons for believing in God, right? Whether we take like arguments for contingency that I think really do give us a certain definitive knowledge of a God that is the God of classical theism, right? Absolutely simple, non-composite, wholly good, omniscient, omnipotent, etc. Once you have that, we should also always look at like what is unclear in light of what is clear. I think this is a really important principle. And I believe it was Fulton Sheen who said that 1,000 difficulties should never amount to a single doubt. And there's a lot of things, there's a lot of experiences and data points that, I might not be able to explain well. For example, I was talking with somebody one time, we were having this type of conversation. We actually really moved along, and he was starting to lean, he was more agnostic, and he started to lean towards theism. And he said, well, what about black holes, right? He's like, why would God make black holes? And the answer is, I have no idea, right? I really don't. But a difficulty or a mystery or a question is not an objection. And if I already have prior independent reasons, especially if I think they're really good reasons to believe in an omniscient God, then I have good reason to believe that an omniscient God has good reason to create black holes, even if I can't see what that reason is. Yeah. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Just because I can't see a reason for something doesn't mean that there isn't a reason for something. And that's probably maybe just something for everybody, for all the listeners, just for your own personal confidence in your faith, is don't confuse questions or mysteries or difficulties with objections. They're not the same thing.
Yeah, and that's very common too. I run into that a lot where, it's like, okay, explain to me the mind of God on this matter. It's like, I'm not God, I'm not omniscient. I don't have access to all the data, and I'm not, perfectly good, perfection of all perfections. I can't tap into the wisdom behind it. But I do know that such a being does exist, and ultimately there is an answer. Yeah,
and we shouldn't be surprised at mysteries. Like why do mysteries surprise us? We are finite, limited beings in this material created world that an omnipotent being created. So just by our very nature, we should expect that there's going to be mysteries and questions that we just don't know the answer to, and that we may never find the answer to, at least not here in this life. And that's okay. It doesn't need to be a reason for doubt.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and that's excellent advice for the listeners, because, don't run off in these rabbit trails. They're almost like red herrings. There should be mysteries, just like you said. And if there wasn't mysteries, then you'd wonder whether such a God as what we believe in existed, right? Because it would have to be finite and totally explanatory.
Yeah, exactly. And mysteries aren't, it's not just about black holes or the mysteries of the world. There's mysteries of theology as well. The Eucharist is fundamentally a mystery. The Trinity is a mystery. And we can show that it's coherent, that there's no logical contradiction. But at some point, we just have to step back. And I love Peter Kreeft's reminder on this, where he reminds us that Jesus said, take and eat. He didn't say take and understand. He said take and eat, right? So mysteries are a good thing, that there's opportunities for trust in mysteries and humility in mysteries to develop in virtue. And it's not like, we accept mysteries because we're gullible or stupid. We accept mysteries because we believe they've been divinely revealed, and we have good reason for accepting them as being divinely revealed. So we have good reason for accepting mysteries. And that's also an important point to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, so we can know that something happens, not necessarily why something happens.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a little bit of a diversion there, but it popped into my head over the break.
No, that's an important one, because I've run into lots of cases where it's like, explain me this, and I think, and many times I fall for it. I try to give all the different scenarios. Well, maybe this, maybe that, but ultimately, you're right. According to our worldview, there should be mysteries, and all the points you made,
and speculation can be fun. Don't get me wrong. Like I've definitely tried to think about, well, why? What's the point of black holes, right? Like there's fun in that, but having that, clearly in your mind that you're just speculating, right?
Yeah, right.
And that this is not a serious objection or reason for doubt, but you're just curious, and that's fine. But make that distinction.
Us to a deeper understanding,
Right.
If we just said, well, it's a mystery, there wouldn't be an advance in knowledge, because everything that we don't know would be, well, it's just a mystery. Don't look into it.
And certainly we try to understand the Trinity. We try to understand the real presence and transubstantiation, and there's good fruits that come of that as well. We want to, and certainly the mysteries of the world, we want to continue our scientific investigation. Nobody's trying to slow down. No, we're all for that. It's just that, again, at this point, if somebody were to ask me to, like you said, explain this, explain that, there's a lot that I'll just have to put my hands up and say, look, I don't know, but here's what I do know. Here's what's clear to me. And we can use what's clear to look at what is unclear. And it might just still be a mystery, but based on what's clear, what is unclear does not need to be a reason for doubt.
Yeah, very good. Now, in your list of cumulative arguments, you touched on one that I think is a great argument that's so obvious that it's almost never explored, and that is the plain fact that the Catholic Church exists today, that no one can deny, and that it's existed for 2,000 years. How do you explain that?
Gary, I have to say, when I was a skeptic, this is something that really jarred me, and because it seems hard to just account for this in terms of a bumbling bureaucracy. There's a redundancy, bumbling bureaucracy, right? Like it just doesn't seem possible. And not just that it's survived this long, but that it's been consistent on its essential teachings of faith and morals. And one of the things that really in spite of enormous social and political pressure and corruption, right? Well, I think every Catholic would freely admit that there has been terrible corruption. So in spite of every opportunity to disintegrate and change, it hasn't. Now, Catholics know that Christ promised that his church would prevail against the gates of hell. So it seems like it fits well with that promise, that Christ's promise is really being kept. But I will say, as a skeptic, one thing that really struck me initially and it was interesting as I was kind of really studying traditional natural law was the issue of birth control and seeing the history of birth control. And you could see how pretty much all of Christianity, just, like a stack of dominoes, started collapsing on this issue, starting, I believe, with the Anglican Church in the 1920s. And that really fascinated me because what church stood firm? It was the Catholic Church. And that really, and I wonder, well, why is that? Why is it the Catholic Church was able to stand firm on its teachings of sexual ethics and birth control when all these other denominations were just kind of falling away with culture? And that caused me to want to investigate more seriously the teachings of the church and the consistency through time. And what I discovered is now what I use as part of this cumulative case is that I couldn't explain it. Right. This is clearly God's providence at work, that God is keeping his promise in guiding and protecting the church, because you just cannot explain the existence or consistency of the Catholic Church through 2,000 years through human efforts alone. I think it's too fantastic. I don't have enough faith to believe in that. Right.
Yeah.
I need God's assistance.
Yeah, I love that because, it starts from an undeniable premise that the church is here. And if you look at your church history, the weird thing is whenever the church becomes more like what you expect an empire or an organization to exist, like military might, property, things like that, that's when the church does worse. It's when it's in the form where it would least likely survive, loving your enemies, being persecuted, that it explodes,
Right.
It's so counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you picked that one because that was something that really struck me as an outsider. And at first because coming from more of a secular background, you see these teachings of the church and you're like, oh, they're so archaic, right? They're so outdated. But then as your perspective begins to shift and change, you're like, oh, no, they were just right all along. And it's culture that is the problem, right? That's relativistic and just up and down and left and right and can't make up its mind. But it's the church that is that foundation of truth that has been consistent through the centuries. So it's funny, what was initially sort of repellent to me, what I saw as Catholicism sort of being backwards, eventually became extremely attractive to me and pointed to the truth of the Catholic faith.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I bet that kind of dovetailed with your work in theistic apologetics, because Aristotle, all the Aristotle, Plato, these are old archaic philosophers, not like
right.
the new, shiny new atheism or something like that, right?
Yeah, I had to overcome my chronological condescension, and that was a hard lesson learned of just thinking because somebody's old. What do they have to say, right? Those unfortunate, stupid souls, they weren't around, in the past 10 years when all the really good stuff has been discovered and known. That was a very foolish assumption I had for some time, and fortunately, I think I've been disabused of it.
Awesome. Well, where can people go to get a hold of all your great stuff?
chroniclesofstrength.com. You can find everything there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Pat, for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. A pleasure.
Awesome. Pat Flynn, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it's chroniclesofstrength.com. All one word. Check it out. And coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. It's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center. Have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
I'm a soul.